Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about Craftworld Eldar Striking Scorpions in 10th edition and how to use them. So, Striking Scorpions were always one of my favorite units. I remember they were one of the first combat units I ever picked up as a fledgling Eldar player. Of course, they were the old models, the 3rd and 4th edition models, but I absolutely loved them. I loved the fact that they could infiltrate across the battlefield, deploy behind some terrain, and ambush enemy units as they came in. This was a really cool idea, and even though back then I couldn't really grasp the strategy and the concept behind it, I thought they were super cool. Then, of course, 5th edition pretty much ruined that because True Line of Sight was a thing. So that was it. I shelved my Striking Scorpions for a pretty long time after that. I did have the models still, but I barely used them that edition. In 9th edition, it was a different story. Striking Scorpions were very strong, their melee potential was very good, and they had quite a bit of utility. They could put pressure on enemy units in the early game, get early alpha strikes off, and if you didn't get first turn, you could always phantasm them back into reserve, where they could be a constant threat to enemy units. In this edition, they do pretty much the same thing as they did last edition. Their melee is really good, although they are a little bit weaker than they were last edition. Their melee power isn't as good. It's almost there, but not quite. And their ability to phantasm back into reserve is gone completely. So they can't do that. They can reposition or redeploy with Riel, but they can't just phantasm after you find out who gets first turn or not. However, to compensate for this, they have had a few changes. So let's go ahead and dive right into it and talk about how to use Striking Scorpions in 10th edition. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of Striking Scorpions, their strengths and weaknesses, combos and synergies, and of course, the role that Striking Scorpions play in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them. So, Striking Scorpions have an average movement at 7 inches, which is pretty standard, same as Dire Avengers. They have a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable, so their armor save is a little bit better. I kind of find this funny because usually when Eldar units have a slightly better armor save, it just doesn't matter all too much, although it will help you in some scenarios against units that really can't strike back anyway. Meaning that if they're going against a unit that they've already basically beat in close combat, you'll have less of a chance of losing one of them in return. As for their melee weapons, the Scorpion Chainsword has 4 attacks with 0 AP and sustained hits. This is basically the same as it was before, except they lost an AP on their weapons, which happened to every single unit in the game, so this wasn't surprising. The Exarch weapons, both the Biting Blade and Scorpion's Claw, have damage 2 with sustained hits. The Claw has more AP and strength, but lower attacks, and hits on a 4+ over the Biting Blade. Really, I think it comes down to personal preference with this. They're both pretty good. The Scorpion's Claw is my preferred one in this edition. I know it hits on 4+, but it has a greater strength. It wounds Marines on 2s instead of 3s. Wounds Terminators on 3s instead of 4s. Has a better AP, obviously, which is important. And it only has 1 less attack. Now, here's the thing about the Scorpion's Claw as well. It comes with a 2-shot pistol in addition to your regular pistol. So you can actually fire 3 pistol shots in combat as well. So yeah, not the greatest. I know I'm trying to argue over the Claw because of its pistol attacks, which has never been the case. But I do think it puts it slightly over the edge against the Biting Blade. Now, of course, the Biting Blade is still very good. If you're just going for mortals and sustained, I think Biting Blade is obviously the winner here. But if you're going for a little bit more of a punch, the Scorpion's Claw has you covered. And I'm really glad they made it Strength 8. Super helpful. I'm glad it wasn't Strength 6 like it was in past editions. Strength 6 is absolutely useless. As far as ranged weapons, are all armed with shuriken pistols. The Scorpion's Claw actually does count as a pistol and has 1 additional attack over a pistol. So it's basically a shuriken pistol with 1 extra attack. Now, this is in addition, again, if you arm the Exarch with the Scorpion's Claw, the Claw actually replaces the Chainsword. So your Exarch can actually fire both profiles, both the shuriken pistol profile and the Scorpion's Claw profile. Because they're pistols, they can fire both of them. And that's really cool. That means this guy basically gets 3 shots at range versus the Biting Blade, which will get 0. As for their abilities, they do have the Infiltrator's ability, which means they can deploy anywhere outside of 9 inches of enemies. I think the best thing to do with these guys is just use them as a deterrent to your enemy deploying in certain areas and making your opponent think hard about where he wants to deploy. So, great way to do this is to just wait and deploy them last. Don't deploy them first, deploy them at the very last if your opponent doesn't have other infiltrators. Use your rangers and stuff like that to deny enemy infiltrators. Don't use these guys unless these guys are literally your only infiltrators in the army. Use your rangers first. They're a little bit cheaper, they're a little bit more expendable, and then these guys can come in and deploy wherever they want in safety. And also 9 inches away from enemy units so that if you do get first turn, you can get a guaranteed charge off. But just keep in mind that this is just a 50-50 chance of you winning a dice roll with your opponent. So make sure that if you do actually deploy them within range of an enemy unit, that they're also within obscuring terrain from most of the enemy army. You don't want these guys shot off the board turn 1. The unit also has Manda Blasters, which give it devastating wounds against everything except monsters and vehicles. So this is really cool as well because this includes mounted units. This includes basically everything that is not a monster or a vehicle. So that's pretty cool. That's, I think, something they had last edition as well, so it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But they could have easily just made it effective against infantry, which would have been really shitty. So I'm really glad they actually kept this. Now, the upside to this is that, yes, they don't get additional damage on top of the regular damage. It's just a mortal wound. But for the Exarch, this actually matters because his weapons have damage too. So with each mortal wound that you score, you're going to be getting 2 mortal wounds instead of just 1. So that's a little bit of a bonus. The Exarch, as I said before, can take a Biting Blade or Scorpion's Claw. If you take the Claw, again, you get to shoot the regular pistol as well as the Claw's pistol, which is awesome, guys. That's 3 pistol shots. Basically, you're running around with dual pistols. That's a pretty cool thing, and I think Scorpions have to rely a little bit more on their shooting attacks than before because their melee is a little bit nerfed from last edition. As far as their unit composition, they can be taken in units of 5 or 10. They cost 75 points for 5 and 150 for 10, which is actually pretty cheap. That means these guys are only 15 points a model. That is much cheaper than last edition. That is 3 points less per model than last edition. Yes, they lost some combat prowess, but they also got a drop in points to reflect that, which I think is good. I think that's fair, considering units like Howling Banshees only dropped by a single point and got a lot worse. So I think Striking Scorpions made it out pretty much healthy as far as a melee unit goes. This means that they are a bit expendable. A unit of 5 is nothing to, basically worry about. If you charge in, do some damage, if that unit is then lost, it's okay because it's made up its points value and it's made up its value in the pressure it's put on your opponent. Even at 150 points, yeah, you're probably not going to want to run a squad of 10 of these guys, but even at 150, they're pretty good. You can have them coming out of reserve, targeting an enemy unit out of reserve, and they can do some serious damage for a pretty reasonable cost. As far as their keywords go, they are infantry, so they can move through terrain no issues, which is a very important thing for a unit that is going to want to be surrounding itself with obscuring terrain in most of the game. Okay, so what are their strengths and weaknesses? So their biggest strength is that they can infiltrate and establish board control or set up an alpha strike. That's basically where their strength lies. But to back this up, they have a lot of attacks with sustained hits and devastating wounds, so they can threaten basically all lighter infantry. So what I mean by lighter infantry is, of course, they can threaten things like cultists and guardsmen and things like that, and they can rip them apart. But they can also threaten units like scout snipers and other scouting elements of opponents' armies. So, your sniper units, your other infiltrators, they do a very good job at taking out, and they trade well against all of them. If you look at any army's scouting elements, these guys will outtrade them pretty much every time for the points. Unless, of course, they die to Overwatch, which is very possible still. They are a very fragile unit, and they're still a bit vulnerable to it. Overwatch is the bane of a lot of our combat units in this edition. They're also not great at killing heavy infantry, tougher than a mech equivalent, so anything stronger than a regular Space Marine, they're going to have issues with. Terminators especially. Yeah, they can run into a unit of Terminators, but they're going to be wounding on 5s, and they're really going to be leaning in on those devastating wounds, and they're just not going to do a lot of damage. When you charge in, you'll probably kill about one Terminator, and that's assuming you didn't lose anything to Overwatch, which again, Terminators do have Storm Bolters. They're very good in Overwatch, especially with buffs. So definitely watch out against those types of targets. As for their combos and synergies, you could attach Karandras to them and give them +1 to hit. However, his own ability only affects himself. He's kind of like a solo fighter in that way, as he was last edition. Falcons can give the rerolls to Wound, which pairs well with Devastating Wound. So if you do want to use these guys as a purely defensive unit or as an offensive unit in a Falcon, you can do so. Falcons are obviously really good damage multipliers. And rerolling Wounds with a unit that already has Devastating Wounds is quite powerful. As far as units that can prevent Overwatch, Wave Serpents, Death Jesters, and Wraithseers can basically try to help them in that way, but it is a risk because your opponent could always pass those tests and you could be left out in the open getting shot anyways. So do watch out for that. And lastly, because of their cheap cost and abilities, in my opinion, they actually operate quite well independently without buffs. So what this means is they're an Eldar unit that doesn't need a whole lot of synergy to operate effectively. They do their job well because they have the ability to infiltrate and they're pretty self-contained. They have everything they need to do a good job putting pressure on enemy units without having to worry about different buffs to help them out, like Howling Banshees do. And again, Howling Banshees are something I covered the other day. A lot of people are not too happy with Howling Banshees, and that makes sense. They are quite a bit weaker in melee. They do have a role in an Eldar army, but unlike Striking Scorpions, Howling Banshees need some support. Striking Scorpions don't really need that support because their infiltrate ability and ability to put pressure on enemy units is quite strong. Okay, so having said all that, what is the role of Striking Scorpions in an Eldar army and how do you make the most out of them? Well, Striking Scorpions are pure and simple a forward deployment unit designed to take out backline units or scouting elements. And this helps you control the board and control the pace of the battle and put a lot of mental stress on your opponent, who will have to deploy their forces with the Striking Scorpions in mind. Striking Scorpions can also be put in reserve, and this works extremely well as they can threaten backline units once the opponent's most dangerous units are dealt with and the battle has raged for a couple of turns. And again, this is going to put pressure on your opponent, who will have to allocate resources to either stopping the Striking Scorpions or making sure that when they do come in, they don't have good targets. Which means the rest of your army will be in a better position throughout the game. Your opponent will not be able to hunker behind obscuring terrain as safely and will have to mitigate that somehow. Either by setting up screening units, which again, if they do screen, those screening units are going to be vulnerable and within line of sight. So Striking Scorpions can do more than just their damage represents on the battlefield. And once they are in the opponent's backfield, they can score big on secondary objectives and hide behind obscuring terrain themselves. So unless your opponent has a lot more indirect fire in their list, they're pretty much going to be safe in the late game. You could even come in on turn 4 if you wanted to. There's nothing stopping you or preventing you from coming in that late, killing a key target in the back, something small that's on an objective that maybe is just there to hold objectives, and then just sit on that objective themselves. They're not 110 points anymore, so you don't have to feel obligated to get their full points value killed in any particular game. Okay, so in conclusion, Striking Scorpions are a really solid unit that are great at applying pressure to your opponent's backline and also pressure to their infiltrators and scouts, who they can easily take out in close combat. Their cheap cost allows them to trade well against the aforementioned units, the scouting elements of your opponent's army, or the, objective sitters and stuff like that, while also remaining expendable. And I really do think that's a key part of the equation there. Because they're only 75 points, because there's no guarantee that you're not going to be overwatched or, you're not going to be basically getting the first turn in any particular game, your Striking Scorpions aren't so expensive that losing them would cost you a large part of your army. Only 75 points means that if your opponent does have a clever way to deal with them, let's say your opponent does go first and does have a way to just eliminate them from the battle, it's not the worst thing that can happen, right? I mean, you will probably lose the unit, but You can always phantasm behind obscuring terrain if you need to. I know it's a command point, but if you want to save your scorpions, that's a good thing. And you can be in a position to block enemy units and create issues for them later on in the game. And I think just being able to dictate where your opponent deploys and how your opponent moves and stuff like that throughout the game is well worth the 75 points you pay for this unit, even if they never really show up and kill all that much. And just think about it for a second. If this unit, either infiltrating or being put in reserve, forces your opponent to deploy in a different way than they were normally going to do, and that gives you a lane of line of sight or a target of opportunity within those first couple of turns that you can target with your shooting units, well then the striking scorpions have already made up their points cost without having to swing a single chainsword. And that, my friends, is worth its weight in gold. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my Patrons and supporters who have helped the channel over the last months. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you do want to become a Patreon member and join our Discord community as well, I will leave the links in the description for you so that you can find them. My Patreon does have free trials turned on, so you won't have to pay a single dime to join the Eldar Discord community, which is growing fast. And it's a place where you can talk about Eldar tactics, strategies, and of course, hobbying. I also have a channel merchandise store you guys can check out. I'll leave the link in the description as well. Basically just a lot of t-shirts, sweaters, apparel with Eldar inspired designs on them. If you're wanting to rep your favorite faction at your local game store, come check it out. Other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out and have some great games this week. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.